Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
Jesus said to the chief priests and the elders of the people, "Hear another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a hedge around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a tower. Then he leased it to tenants, and he went on a journey. When vintage time drew near, he sent his servants to the tenants to obtain his produce. But the tenants seized the servants, and one they beat, another they killed, and a third they stoned. Again, he sent other servants, more numerous than the first ones, but they treated them the same way. Finally, he sent his son to them, thinking, 'They will respect my son.' But when the tenants saw the son, they said to one another, 'This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and acquire his inheritance.' So they seized him, threw him out of the vineyard, and killed him. What will the owner of the vineyard do to those tenants when he comes?" They answered him, "He will put those wretched men to a wretched death and lease his vineyard to other tenants, who will give him the produce at the proper times." Jesus said to them, "Did you never read in the Scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. By the Lord has this been done, and it is wonderful in our eyes. Therefore I say to you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that will produce its fruit." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody who was at the Octaco Fest last night and everybody who helped out with the bazaar. We had an immense number of donations to the Country Kitchen, the silent auction. One of the people in the silent auction, they said, "This is like St. Bernard of old." And this is amazing, right? So I'm really proud of how we did yesterday and how much everybody contributed. Seeing the bazaar not as just something, an event that our parish does, but it's our biggest fundraiser of the year. So I really love how everybody contributed to the great event. And I also apologize. I know that I'm probably not alone in this, but I'm a little bit tired this morning. I would suspect there's probably going to be a high attendance at the Wabash Mass tonight. A lot of people who are at the Taco Fest. But we're beginning the month of October, and something we did last year that I want to do again this year is I want to spend the month of October reviewing some of the basic tenets of our faith. There's a lot of people who wonder about what Catholics believe and why we do what we do. And sometimes when people ask us questions, we aren't really prepared to respond. And so I think it's good for us to spend 1 month every year, right, reviewing some of these basics of our faith and why we hold them to be true. So to get us started out, I want to ask Ben Hoppy. Can you bring that picture up here, Ben? And show it to the congregation here. Got a nice big print today of this person. Anybody know who this person is? He's a saint. He's a recently canonized saint. Anybody know who the saint is? Cindy? Newman, exactly. St. John Henry. She was here last night. She is very smart, right? Very educated. But she was also here last night. Right? Very good. Right? Sorry, I had to let out the secret. Anyway, this is St. John Henry Newman. Okay, so we have at Wabash College, we have the Newman Center. It's named after St. John Henry Newman. So a lot of different colleges and universities that are not Catholic universities, they typically have a Newman Center. And it's like a hub for the Catholics. And so we have that at Wabash as well, as you all know. But maybe you've heard the name, but maybe you don't really know the story of Newman. Newman is really one of my favorite saints. I know I say that a lot, but I really mean it with Newman. I had a class on him when I was in seminary. I got to read all his writings. I happened to be in England when he was beatified in 2010 in Birmingham, England. And so I really do love St. John Henry Newman. I think that he's a very important person. St. John Henry Newman, he lived in the 1800s, and he lived in England. And that's significant that he lived in that time and in that place, because in the 1800s, all across Western civilization, there was something called the Enlightenment, right? Or the disenchantment. How many of you heard of the word enlightenment, right? From history, right? Basically what it meant was that the entire Western civilization was going through a process of secularization. It started with the French Revolution in the 1790s. That was the really extreme manifestation of it. But then it really continued all throughout the 1800s. All throughout the world, cultures were becoming more secularized. They were changing their governments from monarchies to democracies, right? They were changing all sorts of the traditional ways of doing things. And one of the big characteristics of that was skepticism about God and skepticism about religion. Now, also Newman was living in England, so not only was he living during the Enlightenment, but he was living in a land that was maybe more than any other country in Europe, that was divided by denominational lines. So some of you, right, you've heard of Anglicans, right, Episcopalians, right? You probably know the story about England, about how King Henry VIII, when the Protestant Reformation started, he was actually a very avid defender of Catholicism. But shortly thereafter, he had an issue that he didn't have a male heir. And so he wanted to divorce his wife so that he could get a new wife. And it ended up getting really ugly. And it ended up leaving the Catholic Church and basically threatening all of his bishops in the country, right, to join him in creating his own church. And that's where Anglicanism comes from. Now, after King Henry VIII, though, there was a lot of division that took place, because when he died, there was no heir. And so one of his relatives, Queen Mary, became the Queen of England. And she wanted the country to be Catholic. And so she basically brought the country back to Catholicism. And some people were executed who were not in favor of that. That's why, if you ever heard of Bloody Mary, right? That drink, it's named after Mary, right? The Catholic Queen. And it's a really unfair way that they say that, because really compared to King Henry VIII and her sister Elizabeth, who was after her, were both Protestants, there were thousands upon thousands of people who were executed for being Catholic. She executed about a couple hundred people, right, who were some of the most vocal Protestants. Anyway, that's a story for another day. But so Newman lived in England, and it had been very divided about religion for centuries. And Catholicism had basically been eradicated from the country. Catholics were, if you were Catholic in England, a lot of your rights were restricted. Like if you wanted to teach at Oxford University, for example, you couldn't be a Catholic. So a lot of the different rights were prohibited in his day. And I mention all this because I think it's important for us to be aware of this, because maybe some of us don't realize that we too are also influenced by many of these trends of the Enlightenment and also of the Protestant Reformation. I'll give you an example. How many of you, when you were in school, how many of you were told that in the Middle Ages everybody thought the earth was flat? And that's why Christopher Columbus's discovery was so important. How many of you were taught that in school? I know I was. Right? Do you realize that that's completely made up? That is a complete lie. What intelligent person, think about all those people in the Middle Ages, they were so versed in astronomy. They look at all these planets, all these stars, and you think they would think that their planet was flat? No. Right? People knew the earth was not flat. The reason why Christopher Columbus was so significant is because he vastly underestimated the circumference of our planet. And he would have died if he hadn't found America. He vastly underestimated the difficulty of the voyage. Now, I bring that up because, again, why would people make that up? It was made up in the 1800s. Because they were trying to make a point that in the Middle Ages, when the church was in charge, everybody was stupid and ignorant and uneducated. And now we are enlightened. And there's many other examples, like the Crusades, the Inquisition, right? So many things of how we think about those events are just completely false and backwards. But we're influenced by those skeptical historians and sometimes Protestant historians and how they skew our view of history. So that was the culture that Newman was raised in. And when Newman became an adult, he actually became a minister in the Anglican Church. And he became a part of this movement called the Oxford Movement at the University of Oxford. Right? It's called the Oxford Movement. And basically what he and a few of his professor colleagues, they realized that in their age of Christianity, there were a lot of errors that were being introduced. They knew they didn't want to be like the Catholics, because the Catholics are just completely depraved and lost. That was their perspective. But they also realized that a lot of different denominations of Protestantism were really going off the deep end in terms of traditional Christian teachings. And so the Oxford movement was about finding a via media, right? A middle way. We don't want to be like the Catholics, but we don't really want to be like some of these strands of Protestantism. We want to find a middle ground. And so what Newman started doing is he started studying the earliest days of the church. He started studying church history, especially the early days. And he said, if we really want pure Christianity, we need to go back to the roots, back to the beginning. And he started researching and studying. He was one of the most well-known theologians of his age. And so he started writing this book. It was called The Essay of Development of Christian Doctrine. And as he was studying the earliest days of the church, he realized something. There really was no such thing as the middle way between Catholics and Protestants. Rather, there was only one way, and the one way was Catholicism. Every early church writing he read was immensely Catholic. And he thought, for example, why do they have so much devotion to Mary? And then when he read the early church, sure enough, they had a great devotion to Mary. Why do the Catholics have the Pope and the authority of all these bishops? And when you read church history, you discover that every time there was a major disagreement, sure enough, it was the Pope who was the one who settled that. He realized that at the very beginning of Christianity was already Catholic. And so he actually wrote these famous words. He said, "To understand history is to cease to be a Protestant." And he wrote that as a Protestant. He didn't mean it in a pejorative way. He meant literally, the more I study history, the more I realize that I can no longer be a Protestant. And he ended up converted to Catholicism after writing that book. And he really sacrificed a lot. He gave up a lot of things. He could no longer be a professor at Oxford. Most of his best friends and colleagues, they basically disowned him because they saw him as a traitor. And then when he became a Catholic, even the Catholics kind of were suspicious of him because he had been such a prominent Protestant theologian. So he sacrificed a lot. I bring this story about Newman, not only because, again, I find it an inspiring story about someone who was so adamant about the search for truth, that he was willing to sacrifice everything, but also as a reminder to each of us. Because to be honest with you, there's a lot of things that we do as Catholics that might just seem really weird, strange. I know when I was a kid, for example, being Catholic, I thought being Catholic was lame. Like, man, you got all these rituals and prayers. On a couple of occasions, I went to church with some Protestant friends, and it was like, you got this exciting music. You got these great Bible stories, right? It's like, man, being Catholic is lame, But whether or not you feel that way, the truth remains. Christianity has always been Catholic. We've always had the altars, the incense, the devotion to the saints, the rituals. Modern versions of Christianity that we see in Protestant denominations, they are completely foreign to what the church was for the first 1,500 years of her existence. And so I just encourage you, the next time somebody asks you questions about Catholicism, why do you do all these strange things? Your question should be, why don't you? Because basically what you have to believe as a Protestant, again, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, this is just what Newman discovered. You have to believe, if you're a Protestant, that for 1,500 years, all Christians were wrong. And it wasn't until 500 years ago where you found the truth. Do we really believe that? Does that make much sense? To understand history is to cease to be a Protestant. And that is one of the beautiful things about being Catholic. We are truly rooted in history. We are the original church. And that's something to be admired and appreciated.